Good evening, everyone. A little over 4 years ago, my college on the other side of Queen's Park played host to a symposium entitled Healing Chalcedon, held to mark the 25th anniversary of the agreed statements of the Joint Commission of the Theological Dialogue between the Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox churches, which were issued in 1989 and 1990. Although it was devoted to Eastern Christian theology, the symposium was dedicated to the honor of a Canadian Anglican bishop, the late Henry Hill, who had labored conspicuously to make Western Christians better aware first of the existence and then of the history, theology, and traditions of the Oriental Orthodox churches. The symposium's organizers had therefore decided that it would be appropriate if the first and last papers of the event were delivered by Anglicans. For the opening keynote lecture, they were fortunate in securing the Reverend Canon Alison Barnett Cowan, who, as president of the Canadian Council of Churches and a veteran ecumenist, could speak with authority about the involvement of Anglicans at what she called the table of Orthodox dialogue. For the final paper of the day, however, when everyone was likely to be impatient to go home anyway, they made do with a completely unknown Anglican professor who happened to be close to hand, namely me. As I'm sure many of you will know, our dear Dr. Butcher is tireless and indeed relentless in his pursuit of lecturers for this wonderful series, despite the protests of many of them, especially myself, that they are unqualified to address anyone about Eastern Christianity, never mind an audience at the Sheptytsky Institute. It was he who suggested that a reworked version of my remarks at that symposium 4 years ago might be an acceptable offering. If you find that my lecture tonight has more to do with Anglican introspection than with Eastern Christianity, you may blame Dr. Butcher. On the other hand, one of the points I hope to make this evening is that true ecumenical encounter ought to draw separated Christians not just closer to each other, but ever more deeply into their own traditions. If the self-referential reflections of an Anglican looking from the outside at Eastern and Oriental Orthodox dialogue happen to provoke similar self-reflection in, say, a Ukrainian Catholic, I will consider myself amply rewarded. In the summer of 1839, a scholar at Oriel College, Oxford, was hard at work reading about the Council of Chalcedon of 451 and its aftermath. 6 years earlier, in 1833, he had published a pioneering history of the Arians of the 4th century. More recently, he had been devoting considerable time and energy to contemporary theological controversy, in which he was arguing that the Church of England was a via media, a middle way, between the deficiencies of continental Protestantism and the excesses of Roman Catholicism. With the end of the academic teaching year, he was returning to his earlier materials on doctrinal controversies in the early church, perhaps contemplating a sequel that would move beyond the Arians of the 4th century to the Monophysites of the 5th, who would reject the Christological definition of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and whose refusal of communion with the imperial church was later to prove so damaging in the Byzantine Empire's confrontation with the expansion of Islam. It was a topic full of potential to fascinate a historian. But as it turned out, this course of summer reading was the beginning of a revolution in that scholar's thinking, not about the past, but about his present. Here's how he recounted the experience over 20 years later. I was returning for the vacation to the course of reading which I had many years before chosen as especially my own. About the middle of June, I began to study and master the history of the Monophysites. I was absorbed in the doctrinal question. It was during this course of reading that for the first time a doubt came upon me of the tenableness of Anglicanism. I recollect on the 30th of July mentioning to a friend whom I had accidentally met how remarkable the history was. But by the end of August, I was seriously alarmed. My stronghold was antiquity. Now here, in the middle of the 5th century, I found, as it seemed to me, Christendom of the 16th and the 19th centuries reflected. I saw my face in that mirror, and I was a Monophysite. The Church of the Via Media, that is the Church of England, was in the position of the Oriental Communion. Rome was where she now is, and the Protestants were the Eutychians. It was difficult to make out how the Eutychians or Monophysites were heretics, unless the Protestants and Anglicans were heretics also. Difficult to find arguments against the Tridentine Fathers, which did not tell against the Fathers of Chalcedon. Difficult to condemn the popes of the 16th century without condemning the popes of the 5th. The drama of religion and the combat of truth and error were ever one and the same. The principles and proceedings of the Roman Church now were those of the Church then. The principles and proceedings of heretics then were those of Protestants now. What was the use of continuing the controversy or defending my position if, after all, I was forging arguments for Arius or Eutyches and turning devil's advocate against the much-enduring Athanasius and the majestic Leo? Be my soul with the saints, and shall I lift up my hand against them? Anathema to the whole tribe of Cranmers, Ridleys, Latimers, and Jewels. Perish the names of Bramhall, Usher, Taylor, Stillingfleet, and Barrow from the face of the earth, ere I should do aught but fall at their feet in love and in worship, whose image was continually before my eyes, and whose musical words were ever in my ears and on my tongue. Even from the fantastic prose, I'm sure many of you will have guessed that the author of those words was, of course, John Henry Newman, the future Cardinal Newman, and as of last month, Saint John Henry Newman. In his spiritual autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, he exclaims with an almost audible laugh, "Of all passages of history, since history has been, who would have thought of going to the sayings and doings of old Eutyches and to the enormities of the unprincipled Dioscorus in order to be converted to Rome?" I first read Newman's Apologia not long after I had myself become an Anglican, having grown up in non-denominational evangelicalism. And I have to admit that this passage made me wonder whether I had hitched my wagon to the wrong horse altogether. But the question looks rather different in the light of the agreed statements of the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox dialogue, because the conclusion of that dialogue has been the discovery that the so-called Monophysites were not heretics at all. The Chambézy statement of 1990 expressed this discovery in these words: "We have now clearly understood that both families, that is the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, have always loyally maintained the same authentic Orthodox Christological faith and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, though they have used Christological terms in different ways." Now, that clarity of understanding was not reached until over 1,500 years after the Schism. By contrast, the schism between the Church of England and the Church of Rome isn't even 500 years old yet. So Anglicans may have another 1,000 years to wait before finding out if Roman Catholics will ever discover that they too have maintained the same authentic Catholic faith in unbroken continuity. Of course, the trick will be for Anglicans actually to preserve their faith for that long. And ironically, the ecumenical movement of the past century has often unwittingly weakened the most important means any church has of communicating its faith unimpaired to posterity, namely its liturgy. The dialogue between the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches is very naturally concentrated on Christology, since this was the presenting issue in their original separation. But the communiques and agreed statements issuing from this dialogue have often mentioned the liturgy as an area needing attention. Now, the dialogue is tended towards two conclusions about the liturgy. Number one, any future reunion will require an alteration in some liturgical texts on either side. And number two, a future union will ideally see a measure of liturgical convergence between the churches, with both greater sharing of liturgical texts and progress in liturgical renewal along the lines already pursued by the Catholic and Protestant churches in the 20th century. Against those two tendencies, I would propose some wisdom shared by a childhood friend of my wife, who as an adult completed a solo sea kayak journey around the whole coast of their native Newfoundland. He wrote a book about the experience, which is notable for its account of the highly varied and distinctive local cultures and dialects that he encountered in the island's remotest and most isolated fishing villages. Observing that economic migration, and especially television, were then already pushing those distinctive local cultures to extinction, he offered the following advice. Support multiculturalism. Stay home. Now notice that's exactly contrary to the cry of a xenophobe who says, defend our culture, keep foreigners out. It is instead a frank acknowledgement that a culture cannot survive unless its language, customs, and patterns of thought continue to be the dominant and formative environment into which new generations can be born and grow up. Now, in the church, our concern is not so much culture as the apostolic faith. But as the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox dialogue has shown, the same faith has been preserved in those separated churches under apparently contradictory forms of expression, not in spite of the forms of expression, but precisely because the separated churches tenaciously adhered to them. And a principal means of that adherence has been the liturgy. I would like, therefore, to address from that perspective the two general proposals that, as I mentioned, have emerged from the process of dialogue. Number one, that certain obstacles to reunion that are found in the church's liturgies will need to be changed. And number two, that reunion will best be served by a pan-Orthodox engagement in the wider ecumenical phenomenon of liturgical renewal. My response to both will be to paraphrase my wife's friend. Support Christian unity. Use your own liturgy. So under the first heading of inquiry, liturgical obstacles to reunion, the liturgical scholarship of recent decades has happily cleared up many misunderstandings about the supposedly heretical implications of what are, in fact, ancient and harmless customs. For instance, as Father Daniel Findikian has shown, in 692, the Penthecte Synod, the Council in Trullo, attacked the immemorial custom of the Armenian Apostolic Church of using unleavened bread and a chalice of unmixed wine at the Eucharist. Now, the Synod regarded unleavened bread and unmixed wine as liturgical innovations that had been wickedly introduced to support the Eutychian heresy, which taught that there was only one single nature in Christ. And the misunderstanding went both ways. When in 591, the Armenian Catholicos had been invited to Constantinople to accept the Council of Chalcedon and to restore unity, he replied, "I will not eat their baked bread or drink their hot water." For the Armenians, the unleavened bread and the unmixed chalice of the Eucharist would come to be signs of the incorruptibility of Christ's body. Another Armenian liturgical custom that came under attack was the observance of the Lord's Nativity and Epiphany on the same day, namely January 6th, which was similarly seen by theological opponents as a denial of Christ's two natures. But as all scholars now admit, the whole church originally observed the Nativity and the Epiphany, as the Armenians still do, on one day. This is incidentally a matter in which Anglicans too can claim a minor stake. When the United Kingdom adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, the subtraction of 11 days from the year meant that Christmas Day, December 25th, fell on what would have been Epiphany, January 6th. And in my wife's native Newfoundland, January 6th is still known to this day as Old Christmas Day. Now, sometimes different liturgical practices were regarded as evil merely because they were maintained by heretics. Now, the oldest Byzantine typicon explains that monks ought to eat cheese and eggs in the week before Lent, even on the usual abstinence days, Wednesday and Friday, to confute the Armenian heretics who fast from both at that time of year. A particularly famous point of liturgical controversy was the so-called Theopaschite Trisagion. That's to say, the Trisagion that speaks of God as suffering. You'll all, I'm sure, be familiar with the Eastern Orthodox form of the Trisagion. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and immortal, have mercy on us. But in the later 5th century, the Patriarch of Antioch, Peter the Fuller, inserted an additional phrase so that the Trisagion now read, Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and immortal, who wast crucified for us, have mercy on us. And that entered into the Oriental Orthodox liturgical tradition. Now, again, the Council in Trullo in 692 called this interpolation foreign to true piety. Even though the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Second of Constantinople in 553, had quite plainly said, if anyone declares that the Word of God who works miracles is not identical with the Christ who suffered, let him be anathema. We have here another case of an initially innocuous difference that was subsequently interpreted as heretical, because the Trisagion was originally addressed only to Christ. It was only later Chalcedonian interpretations which saw each separate invocation in the Trisagion as addressed to a different person of the Trinity, and that made the addition, who wast crucified for us, problematic. Now, when the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox dialogue was underway, the state of scholarship on these matters removed any need for the agreed statements to mention them at all. But the statements do repeatedly mention liturgical texts that explicitly condemn other churches. The 1967 Bristol Agreed Statement mentions liturgical deprecations by some churches of theologians regarded by others as doctors and saints of the church. The Addis Ababa Agreed Statement of 1971 foresaw that it would be necessary to prepare the faithful in each church for the removal of anathemas and condemnations that are written into the liturgical texts and hymnody of the church. Now, this very suggestion has been stridently opposed in certain quarters of the separated churches. On the Eastern Orthodox side, the monks of Mount Athos, in a 1995 memorandum that was to become notorious, vigorously objected to purging the liturgical books, whereby the sacred services of many confessors of the faith, of many righteous fathers, and especially the holy fathers of the Fourth Council of the Fourth Council in Chalcedon, will be mutilated. We ask, are all the texts referred to above simply ornamental elements in Orthodox hymnology, so that they can be painlessly and harmlessly removed? Or are they elements of orthodoxy whose removal will cause the eradication of what we understand as orthodoxy? On the Oriental Orthodox side, in 1996, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church issued a formal and favorable reply to the agreed statements. But when it came to liturgical anathemas, it said, since these anathemas have been observed for about 1,500 years by holy fathers, as inscribed in our liturgical texts and hymnody, they shall not be lifted. Now, in part, this reaction reflects a proper hesitancy, I think, to derogate from the high authority given to ecumenical councils in Orthodox ecclesiology. But that objection has been handily disposed of by contemporary scholarship, and in what follows I'm particularly indebted to a paper by Father John Erickson. When we look at how the ecumenical councils talk about the heresies that they condemn, we find that whenever a condemnation is first made, it's extremely precise, setting out the specific propositional errors that are to be rejected. But in later councils, earlier errors will be summarily dismissed by naming as condemned theologians who supposedly taught these errors. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 did not simply condemn Arianism. It said, "And whosoever shall say that there was a time when the Son of God was not, or that before he was begotten he was not, or that he was made of things that were not, or that he is of a different substance or essence from the Father, or that he is a creature, or subject to change or conversion, all that so say, the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathematizes them." But by the time of the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, the condemnation has been reduced to, if anyone does not anathematize Arius, let him be anathema. The anathemas in Orthodox liturgical hymnography ought, in a similar way, I think, to be taken, to be understood as similar shorthand references to more carefully defined errors, which the dialogue reveals were not actually held by the persons named in the anathemas. Take, for example, this Byzantine prosomion for the Feast of the Holy Fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which is observed yearly on the Sunday nearest October 11th. As true shepherds, you bravely drove away the Macedoniuses, the Nestoriuses, the Eutychices, the Dioscorises, Apollinariuses, and Sabellios Severuses, exposed as dangerous wolves in sheepskins, far from the Saviour's flock, stripped of their fleeces, making them thrice wretched. Therefore, we call you blessed. Now, the text is really about condemned theological propositions and the faithfulness of Orthodox pastors in guarding their flocks from the error of following the wording of a separated church. Now, I readily recognize that it would be hard for, say, a Coptic Christian not to wince when he hears that condemnation of Severus as a Sabellian, Severus of Antioch, of whom his own church will sing as follows. The pillar of orthodoxy is Abba Severus, the Patriarch, the teacher of the rational flock of Christ. Your upright teaching defeated the heretics like the two-edged sword through the power of Christ. Well, what perspective can an Anglican offer to his separated Orthodox brethren on matters such as this? Now, the Western liturgy as a whole has never really gone in for liturgical anathemas. I can think of only one in Anglican liturgical history. The original litany in the Book of Common Prayer included the petition, "From the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities, good Lord, deliver us." That was removed under Queen Elizabeth I in 1559. And I must say I'm glad that it was. Though I have some Roman Catholic friends who sometimes speak to me candidly about desiring that God would deliver them from the detestable enormities of certain individual bishops of Rome. But thinking more broadly, what I think Anglicans can directly sympathize with is the way in which the Oriental Orthodox churches have had to wait for modern scholarship to persuade Eastern Orthodox Christians that their liturgical texts are in fact orthodox. Traditional Anglican liturgies that have been seen as ecumenical obstacles have been similarly vindicated, particularly by the new disciplines of social and cultural history. For instance, in those areas that Roman Catholic controversialists most criticized in the past, such as the doctrine of the Eucharist, the understanding of the threefold orders of ministry, or of prayer for the dead, the social history of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer discloses profound continuities with traditional medieval thought and practice, as does the history of attacks on Anglican liturgy by more radical Protestants. Rome may have unchurched us for allegedly having abandoned a sacrificing priesthood, but we were equally unchurched by 17th century Puritans who accused us of keeping it. Anglicans have also shared the experience of seeing their traditional liturgies adopted for use in other churches, where they've been subjected to ostensible corrections to remove heresies or to supply deficiencies. Take, for example, the liturgical books approved for the Western Rite Vicariate of the Antiochian Orthodox Church, which draw heavily on the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, but of course delete the Filioque from the Nicene Creed, but perhaps more significantly, wedge an epiclesis into the Eucharistic prayer. More recently, the Roman Catholic Church has provided liturgies for former Anglicans who have entered the new personal ordinariates. And these rearrange familiar texts from the Book of Common Prayer according to the pattern of the revised Roman liturgies of the 1970s, deleting language held to be erroneous and supplying supposed deficiencies with new compositions that attempt to imitate Tudor prose. For people like me, who are not only stubbornly attached to the traditional Anglican liturgies, but also have devoted much effort to studying them, I have to confess that it's hard not to look at corrections like this without a sense of exasperation and indeed a bit of indignation, because they inevitably apply chunky fixes that spoil an exquisite and delicate balance that we find in the originals, a balance that very effectively communicates, at least to someone formed by the totality of the tradition, who intuitively hears it according to its own principles, the fullness of the apostolic faith. So all of this forces me to sympathize with the Athonite and Ethiopian perspective. Not because I delight in thundering anathemas at fellow Christians, the way that John Henry Newman was thundering anathemas at the Anglican reformers, but because the traditional hymnography of the Orthodox churches is indeed important for the Orthodox faith. The Anglican hymn translator, John Mason Neale, called it this great mass of divinity. And I think to tamper with it out of ecumenical consideration will be like releasing an invasive species into a delicately balanced ecosystem. Interestingly, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, while formally refusing to delete its liturgical anathemas, doesn't seem to regard these as insurmountable obstacles to full communion. Perhaps they will do what I do when I sing the Filioque in the Nicene Creed. Namely, I sing the text, but if I can do so without anybody noticing, I will quietly beat my breast in reparation for the sin of schism. And as a consolation, let's remember that even after Chalcedon, there was a good measure of liturgical exchange between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox churches. For example, scholars now consider it quite possible that whenever Byzantines sing the Troparion, Only Begotten Son and Word of God, after the second antiphon of the Divine Liturgy, they are chanting a text that was actually composed by the anathematized Severus of Antioch. So let's turn now to the second strand of references to the liturgy in the official Orthodox dialogue, namely liturgical renewal. The theme emerges clearly as early as the 1971 Addis Ababa consultation, where in a paper from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, Vitaly Borovoy referred to the need for a pan-Orthodox, from both sides, liturgical renewal. The idea has been taken up more recently in inter-Orthodox liturgical consultations sponsored by the World Council of Churches in Bucharest in 1991 and at New Skeet in the United States in 1998. In all of these consultations, the emergent themes have been those shared by Christian churches of all traditions engaged in the pan-ecumenical exercise of liturgical renewal, namely securing worship in the language of the people, performed by the entire assembly, not just by the clergy, with full participation, a rediscovery of the communal and corporate dimensions of the Eucharist over against private devotion, an expansion of the lectionary, better sermons, we can all agree to that one, a restored daily office, freedom from formalism, and revisions that will inspire the young. The apparatus of scholarship in support of this renewal has been thoroughly modern in outlook, calling for a radical reassessment of traditional liturgical texts. To quote one author, whose language, style, references, symbolisms, imagery, and theological emphases are drawn from another era and a different cultural milieu. To take one example, the same author suggests that the Byzantine prayer for the blessing of the font in the baptismal service needs to be reformulated because it assumes a three-tiered universe. Now, that small point is characteristic of much of the liturgical renewal program of the last century. It betrays, I think, a narrow allegiance to the historical critical methodologies that characterize the 20th century at the expense of other insights and points of view, such as are provided by sociology and anthropology, to say nothing of the study of the texts as literature. And there's something of a Pandora's box to this approach, because if we have difficulty understanding and moving within the traditional language and images of the liturgy, we will find it equally difficult to be at home in the Bible. In my own church, I have encountered clergy who argue, with all sincerity, that the revealed name of the Holy Trinity must likewise be regarded as the product of a different cultural milieu. And since it is unintelligible and even offensive to our own culture, it ought to be altered even in the administration of baptism. As a result, there exists today an unknown number of young Anglicans who, in the eyes of the wider church, and officially in the eyes of their own, have not been validly baptized. How can a church hope to preserve the apostolic faith for even 50 years, never mind 1,500, when it is shy even to speak the name of the God in whom it would teach its catechumens to believe? Well, leaving aside the suggestion that all Orthodox liturgies ought to be renewed by the lights of modernity, I would further note that proponents of this renewal foresee that it will include extensive sharing of liturgical texts across traditional boundaries. The same scholar, Borovoy, writes, "We must re-examine attentively all our inexhaustible wealth of liturgical texts, so amazing in its depth." The 1991 Bucharest consultation remarked that inasmuch as these holy churches have preserved intact extremely precious liturgical traditions, this wealth will certainly enrich the process of renewal and consequent liturgical life. Finally, in 1995, the liturgical subcommittee of the Joint Orthodox Commission gave specific attention to what form a shared liturgy ought to take that could be used to mark the reestablishment of full communion between Eastern and Oriental Orthodox. Anglicans and other Western Christians have had decades of experience now with attempts at ecumenical liturgy, particularly in the form of a radical reception of liturgical texts and practices from separated traditions, and especially from the East. This has been expertly documented in an important paper by a fellow Anglican, John Gibo, entitled Gifts from the Orient. The same approach, to a somewhat lesser extent, informed the Roman Catholic liturgical revisions of the 1960s and 70s. The goal has been to recreate what has proved a largely imaginary golden age of worship in the patristic period. The results have, of course, been very exciting, but not, in my view, very happy. Now, I expect that there are some among you whose hearts are larger than mine, who have now lost patience with me completely, and are suppressing the urge to shout at me the words of the apostle to the English, Pope Gregory the Great, in his answer to the query of Augustine of Canterbury about how there could be one faith but many liturgical forms. "My brother," Gregory responded, "you know the customs of the Roman Church, in which, of course, you were brought up. But it is my wish that if you have found any customs in the Roman or the Gaulish Church or any other church which may be more pleasing to Almighty God, you should make a careful selection of them and sedulously teach the Church of the English, which is still new in the faith, what you have been able to gather from other churches. For things are not to be loved for the sake of a place, but places are to be loved for the sake of their good things. Therefore, choose from every individual church whatever things are devout, religious, and right. And when you have collected these, as it were, into one bundle, see that the minds of the English grow accustomed to it." Well, the converting of a heathen nation was certainly an opportune moment to assemble a diverse liturgical bouquet. Though as it happened, the liturgy of the young English Church was going to be overwhelmingly Roman in character. And as the Dominican scholar Aidan Nichols has observed, the modern Roman Rite has in fact proved a very effective framework that can be fleshed out with the ritual instincts and attitudes of non-Western Christians, already possessed of a venerable high culture, as for example in India. But when we have followed the same course in the long-established Western churches, we've neglected the last line of Gregory's advice: see that the minds of the English grow accustomed to it. Particular and national and cultural instances of the Church Catholic inevitably develop through history their own particular liturgical ethos or genius. And if we attempt to fight against this or to displace it, we risk doing real violence to the Church itself, which is not easily separable from its cultural embodiment. This was an important insight of the Anglican ascetical theologian Martin Thornton in his reflection on the relationship between the Anglican ethos and the ecumenical movement. He said, "If Anglicanism is to play its part in the ecumenical movement, it must be true to itself. The supplanting of matins by the Jesus Prayer and evensong by the Rosary is unlikely to further the cause of reunion with Eastern Orthodoxy or Rome. Ecumenicity may incite morbid fears of insularity or parochialism, and it is necessary to recognize that the Church of England is only a tiny part of the Anglican Communion, which in turn is a small part of the Church militant. But it is a terrible mistake to deduce from this that the ordinary English parish is of no importance. It is admirable that Anglican archbishops should meet with Orthodox patriarchs and Roman prelates, but that many an English village parish is grinding to a standstill is no help to the success of such meetings. The rediscovery of our native spiritual genius and the guidance of individual people by it is neither narrow nor parochial. It is the traditional Catholic way." Well, Thornton wrote those words in 1963. And I regret to say that over the past 50 years, parishes grinding to a halt has become a norm for much of Anglicanism in this country and elsewhere. While overpowering social forces are partly to blame, we must also look to what I can only call the act of cultural suicide that we have perpetrated in our liturgical life over the past half-century. It's often maintained that even in their radically revised forms, contemporary Anglican liturgies from different provinces of the Anglican Communion display a family resemblance. But this is not really true. They resemble each other principally in their loose conformity to a pan-ecumenical standard of liturgical renewal, particularly in their use of Eastern texts, and those not in their vigorous integrity, but in redacted forms reduced to insipid acceptability. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with these new liturgies. Some of them are actually very fine indeed. But they are creations of the committee room, not of the lived experience of the Church. As the Anglican Church historian Owen Chadwick beautifully put it, liturgies are not made. They grow in the devotion of centuries. Now, there's an irony in an Anglican saying that. I mean, after all, we are the product of a traumatic liturgical rupture in the 16th century. But as ruptures go, ours had, I think, a measure of anointing. Chadwick goes on to say this about Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's work in the Book of Common Prayer. As far as a liturgy could ever be the work of a single mind, the prayer book flowed from a scholar with a sure instinct for a people's worship. And that book was not born fully formed. It was gently corrected and adapted for a century after it appeared. It was also prescribed and suffered for in two different periods of Anglican history. So that finally, when a further revision was proposed as recently as 1928 in the Church of England, that revision was overwhelmingly rejected by the laity of the nation, as represented in the House of Commons, showing how closely the existing liturgy and the sensus fidelium, the sensibility of the faithful, were connected. When the participants in the first unofficial Orthodox dialogue at Aarhus in 1964 testified that 15 centuries of alienation have not led us astray from the faith of our fathers, we must attribute that endurance largely to the Church's faithfulness to their liturgical inheritance. This does not mean, however, that there's nothing to be gained from authentic liturgical renewal and organic liturgical interchange. The liturgical renewal movement has erred in two ways. First, it has assumed that liturgy must adapt to reflect contemporary culture, when in fact it must lift us out of contemporary culture. Secondly, it has assumed, at least implicitly, that there is such a thing as a pure archetypal liturgical form that must be resurrected. Even if such a form had existed in the past, it could not be duplicated in today's environment. As a 20th century Colombian philosopher, Nicolas Gómez Dávila, put it, and he spoke as a Roman Catholic, to restore an old liturgical gesture in a new context can amount to heresy. To receive communion standing today, for example, becomes a gesture of pride for a Roman Catholic. Rather, the goal of liturgical renewal ought to be to see with fresh eyes the deep significance of our existing rites and to make more effective use of our inherited liturgical symbols, especially the primary symbols of the sacraments. This process is helped immensely by the deep study and prayerful appreciation of other Christian traditions. To give one example, my own understanding of the classical Anglican daily offices of Matins and Evensong was transformed by reading the writings of Father Robert Taft, who sees Eastern Orthodox morning and evening prayer in terms of anamnesis and the renewal of baptismal illumination. Now, I think the same themes are profoundly present in the Book of Common Prayer, but in a form that could only be intuited by a worshipper who was continually immersed in those rites. By contrast, Father Taft himself, when he looked at the Book of Common Prayer, was unable to see them there. Similarly, it was when I first read that marvelous little book edited by Bishop Henry Hill, whom I mentioned, Light from the East, that I encountered the exhortation of St. Anthony. Lift up your body in which you are clothed and make it an altar, and set thereon all your thoughts, and leave there every evil counsel before the Lord, and lift up the hands of your heart to him, and pray to God that he may grant you his great invisible fire, that it may descend from heaven and consume the altar and all that is on it, and that all the priests of Baal, who are the contrary works of the enemy, may fear and flee from your face, as from the face of Elijah the prophet. And then you will see a cloud like a man's hand over the sea, which will bring you the spiritual rain, which is the comfort of the Comforter's Spirit. Now, an Anglican's liturgical experience cannot help but be transformed when that passage is connected with the mighty words of Archbishop Cranmer in the prayer book's prayer after the reception of communion. And here we offer and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies, to be a reasonable, holy, and lively sacrifice unto thee. And of course, there will always be room for authentic exchanges of liturgical texts and customs. Not on the cutting room of the committee floor, the cutting floor of the committee room, but in the genuine local encounter of worshiping Christians, of a kind that has been documented between Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox for 1,000 years after Chalcedon. On the Anglican side, I might tell you an amusing story of how more explicit liturgical prayer for the departed in Anglican churches can be traced to Queen Victoria's affection for the Russian Kontakion for the dead, which had been beautifully set to music by the organist in her chapel at Windsor Castle. Her heir, King Edward VII, wanted to have it sung at Victoria's funeral in Westminster Abbey, but the Archbishop of Canterbury was worried that it would cause a scandal. Nevertheless, it was actually sung that same day at a memorial service for the Queen in St. Paul's Cathedral, and no one complained. By contrast, what can never work, as far as I can see, is trying to bring about a not yet realized unity by copying the liturgical texts or customs of other churches, while lacking the first clue about their original context or intrinsic meaning. It's hard enough to enter into the authentic spirit of another church's liturgy when one has the benefit of direct experience of it. In the Rare Books collection in Trinity College's library, we've got a lovely little book on the Eastern Orthodox Church that was written by the Reverend Thomas Smith, who in 1688 served as chaplain to the English ambassador to Constantinople. And he was a great liturgical aficionado, and he gives a minute description of Orthodox liturgical practice at Hagia Sophia. But although he observed the rites very accurately, he couldn't understand them at all. So, for instance, having described the reverence with which the bread and wine are greeted at the great entrance, he concludes, "The miscarriage seemed to me when I was present so gross and scandalous as that it needs no other confutation than the bare relating." Just telling you about it is sufficient to condemn it. And in fact, his successor was not so well attuned to the liturgy, and he compared the Orthodox practice of kissing icons to dogs rubbing their noses together. Now, if that was the reaction of highly educated men who could witness the Orthodox liturgical practices at first hand in Orthodoxy's most important church, what hope is there for a half-catechized Toronto Anglican when presented with, say, the anaphora of St. Basil or the Fos Hilaron as resources for enriching our worship? It will only be authentic, liturgical, organic encounters through which the seeds of unity will germinate and bear fruit in our hearts. And they will bear fruit not in the casting off of our distinctive traditions, but in our living into those traditions ever more deeply. One of my favorite Anglican theologians, F.D. Morris, argued that Christian unity would come about not when separated Christians were intellectually persuaded of the legitimacy of other traditions, but when they held even more firmly to the distinctive truths that they had preserved in separation, and by following those truths to their necessary consequences, which would lead them into the fullness of truth. And it's in that hope that I will conclude with words of one more Anglican, C.S. Lewis, writing to a correspondent of his who had just converted to Roman Catholicism. "I believe we are very near to one another, not because I am at all on the Romeward frontier of my own communion. I believe that in the present divided state of Christendom, Those who are at the heart of each division are all closer to one another than those who are at the fringes. Thank you very much for your attention.